Today on the podcast, I'm glad to welcome Kareem Farah, founder of the Modern Classrooms Project. As a teacher in Washington, D.C., Kareem faced problems that many teachers can relate to. Students missing class all the time, and classes made up of students at hugely varied levels. He wanted to try something new because he felt the practices he'd been taught were just not working. Together with his friend Rob Barnett, he created a new instructional model that took into account the fact that students were approaching the materials from different levels and often on different days following absences. He now shares his methodology through his nonprofit, the Modern Classrooms Project, in use by 58,000 teachers in over 150 countries. In this interview, Kareem and I talk about the blended learning approach of the Modern Classrooms Project and how to try it out for yourself, and dig deep into how to combine this approach with creative practices and projects. Are you ready to dive in? Hey there, I'm your host, Betsy Potash, and one-pagers, project-based learning, and choice reading are my jam. I believe in you, and my goal is to help you explore all the creative possibilities you dream of for your classroom. I'm an educator, a chocolate cake aficionado, a traveler who can't wait to get back to Barcelona, and the kind of mom who brings her own mini makerspace to her kid's classroom when she comes to volunteer. I know this for sure, creativity isn't always easy. As a creative teacher, you get parent calls you treasure, and plenty of sidelong comments you'd rather forget. But here's the bottom line. Creative education can ignite a spark in your students and change their lives forever. You and I know this. You're an innovator, and while it's sometimes hard, it's so worth it. So let's explore the world of creative education together. Welcome to the Spark Creativity Teacher Podcast. Well, Kareem, welcome to the show. It's so nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Betsy.
Let's start with how you started in the field of education. Can you tell us a little bit about your life as a teacher and how that kind of impacted your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my teaching career actually in Hawaii. I was a high school math teacher by training. I taught high school math, but I also taught like a sort of career ed advisory course as well. I spent my first 3 years in Hawaii teaching in a community that was serving students that were just experiencing a lot of economic challenges, a lot of truancy challenges, and then we're just academically in really diverse learning levels. I spent my time teaching there using a pretty traditional approach to instruction, sort of your traditional live lectures, have students do a thing, give them an assessment at the end of class to see if they understood the thing. Most of them didn't understand the thing and then just kind of plowed through the next lesson the next day. I moved to DC in 2016 to continue my teaching career. Again, working in a community that just served students who were experiencing pretty high need. And it was at that stage in sort of year 4 of my teaching career that I realized I could no longer continue in the career using a one size fits all sort of traditional approach to instruction. I wasn't feeling successful. I wasn't meeting my students' needs. And that's when I started to innovate in my classroom. So I designed the Modern Classrooms model in 2016 with my co-founder, taught there for 3 years. And then when the model was working really well, decided that we were going to scale it through the nonprofit and left the classroom at the end of school year 2018, 2019.
Wow. So tell us, you made this big pivot. You came up with a new process. What was the process? What were the innovations of the Modern Classrooms Project?
Yeah, so the first thing I always tell folks is we had no intention of creating an innovation as much as we had the intention of creating a classroom that worked for our
Yeah.
students. We now are scaling an instructional model through our nonprofit, but at the time, we, like many teachers, were frustrated by our inability to meet students' needs and wanted to find a better way. So the first thing we started with was this recognition that live lectures were really a terribly ineffective use of our time and student time. Any moment where we were sort of standing at the front of the room talking at students, and students were just basically supposed to listen and wait for a check for understanding and largely taking notes, was just not working. It was not working for a multitude of reasons. I mean, one, the students weren't actually learning. Two, it was where a huge percentage of the behavior issues would start to develop and sort of escalate. And three, it was a giant waste of our time. It was exhausting, and it wasn't, we were losing time where we would leave the kind of front of the room and suddenly a small fraction of the class periods available for us to actually do the most important part of teaching, which is working one-on-one in small groups. So first thing we did was realize, look, we can actually build these little bite-sized videos. So whenever we are supposed to be delivering direct instruction at the front of the room, why don't we actually record an instructional video? They have to be 9 minutes or under, ideally 6 minutes. They can be really nice and bite-sized, and allow students who are absent, who are struggling with emotional distress and need to take a break, who have language barriers and need to pause and rewind, all to have access to this content anytime, anywhere. Once we did that and we were no longer at the front of the room, then we realized, well, now kids can actually be at different spots within a learning sequence. And that's when we introduced self-pacing into the learning equation, where students would be self-paced 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time, usually at most, um, because they were no longer relying on this sort of live delivery of information, this kind of performance at the front of the room. And then once we unleashed self-pacing, that's when we were able to grade students for mastery or competency. We realized that once you introduce self-pacing, now the primary indicator for why a student travels from lesson 2 to lesson 3 isn't day of the week, but it is their understanding of the skill. So that's what we created. We created in our math classrooms, but today this is really a curriculum and content area agnostic and grade level agnostic model. So we have thousands of educators who are English teachers and history teachers and science teachers and arts teachers who do the instructional approach at the kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade level.
Wow. So walk us through um, 1 week in your classroom when you're using this approach. What does the homework look like? What does the day-to-day look like? Where's student A? Where's student B? Just kind of give us the vision.
Yeah, so I like to, like, the first thing is, it depends on if you're starting a new sequence or you're in the middle of a sequence. So let's
Sure.
imagine this is a 2 week self-paced learning sequence and you're actually walking into the classroom and the students are in week 2.
Okay.
Um, so that means, like, if you're on pace, meaning the student has followed the pacing that you've suggested for them, let's just say you ideally are working on lesson 4 on Monday. Well, when you walk into the class, you're going to have some students that aren't on pace. They're working on lessons 2 and 3. You have some students that are ahead of pace. They're working on lessons 5 through 6. And the bulk of the students are likely on pace and working on lesson 4. Now, there's a methodology that every educator uses to ensure that students know where they're at and the teacher knows where they're at. So a lot of times when I describe what walking into a classroom is, I actually start with the pacing tracker. So frequently, that's a game board. Sometimes it's a physical tracker at the front of the room, but that indicates what the student's actually working on. So when the students come into class, you usually open with sort of a just kind of come together at the beginning of class.
Mm.
That might be a little bit of some sort of spiral content or activity for 5 to 7 minutes, or it's just a, hey, here's where we're at, here's where we're going, here's what you need to be accomplishing, and then a release into the self-paced learning sequence. Um, Once you kind of complete that opening, the students start learning. So a student will literally end up picking up where they left off. So a student on lesson 3 might be starting the lesson. So they're going to go watch the instructional video, if there's an instructional video, to kind of dig in. You have some students who are in the middle of the lesson, which means they're tackling the activity. So they're going to be working on those activities. Then there's going to be some students at the end of the lesson, they're ready for a mastery check. They're ready to demonstrate their understanding of the skill. So you kind of release and you see this controlled chaos environment. And usually the teacher has their own little station. And in that station is where they're working with students in one-on-one and in small groups. So they're essentially collecting mastery checks and submitted work. They're reviewing it and then calling groups of students down who have the same misconceptions and working with them in that kind of small group, as every other student is kind of driving their own learning experience. In some modern classrooms, it's a very structured grouping model where students are grouped based on, what lesson they're on, or it's heterogeneous grouping. In other modern classrooms, it's kind of an organic structure. Students work with each other as they kind of travel through content. They lean on their peers, their systems and structures to facilitate collaboration, but it isn't necessarily, overly engineered on the grouping. And the class just kind of runs at that point. The students learn for the bulk of the class period through that structure. The teacher spends nearly 100% of their time in one-on-one and small group instruction. Each day, you kind of know exactly where students are at and where they're going. And the next day, you pick up where you left off.
Yeah. Okay. I can really picture it and see a lot of the amazing benefits. I thought it would be fun to zoom in a little bit on this short video creation as a technique for teachers? Because I'm sure that some people listening may be inspired to fully turn over their classroom to the modern classroom's vision, and some may incorporate, some experiments like this where they do 1 week in this model or they do one lesson in this way and see how it works. So let's talk about a teacher who'd like to create their first video-based lesson. How do you coach your teachers on this? How do they build engaging videos?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think to start, every great educator knows you got to start with the end in mind. So we encourage educators to sort of start by picking the lesson that they're going to work on or a group of lessons, making sure you understand what the actual mastery check is going to be first. So what are you building towards? What's
Mhm.
the final way that you want to demonstrate understanding? What's the standard connected to that mastery check? Once you kind of know all that information, then the question is, what information do I actually deliver to the student? This is actually the most interesting step because most educators, let me rephrase that. A lot of educators, when they're used to delivering information at the front of the room, there's no real kind of time constraint that puts pressure on being really lean with what you deliver. But I think we all know that students do the bulk of the learning when they're actually doing the work as opposed to sort of listening to the work. So
Mhm.
when you have to build an instructional video that's 9 minutes or under, ideally six, suddenly you have to think very, very hard about what to include in the kind of direct instruction component of the lesson and what not to include. Generally, we encourage educators to start with building a slide deck.
Mhm.
We're using a slide deck that's already been created. And it's that slide deck that you're going to screencast over and record your instructional video. Usually kind of 3 to 5 slides, but if you have very little bit of content, you're moving through slides very fast. I mean, it could be 20 slides in a 3-minute video. It doesn't really matter how many slides.
Mhm.
You want those slides to be visual. You want them to not be super text heavy. You want them to be engaging. So once you kind of built that slide deck out, then you record. Recordings do not need to be perfect. In fact, it's kind of nice when they're not. Students like to see the authentic teacher in the instructional video. They want the kind of messiness of it almost being conversational. So, what we encourage educators is to not over engineer it, not make it perfect. That adds no value to the learning experience. So once you've built out your slide deck, you pick a screen recorder. They all do the same thing. Everyone has their own preferences. There's free versions. Some cost a little bit of money, but they're pretty low cost subscriptions. Things like Screencast-O-Matic, Screencastify, Loom, Canvas Video. All these tools do the same thing.
Mhm.
You hit record and you start recording. And you record that instructional video. Some educators really like to use sort of an annotation tool, so a touch screen where they can write on the screen. Those are fabulous. Using animations in those slide decks, so you're kind of doing a slow release of information, is really useful. Trying to get your face in the bottom right corner so the students get to see you is always a nice little touch. And then you record, and you've got to keep those things short. The most important thing is these videos have to be short. The moment that they go above 9 minutes, you start to see a pretty intense spike, uh, in a negative way, of disengagement. And once you hit like 14, the engagement rate is less than 50%. I mean, 14 minutes. So you really got to keep those things bite sized. The last final touch folks usually do, which we call kind of the video enhancements, is once you've created the video, we encourage embedding questions in the video. So a tool like Edpuzzle will do that. A lot of the screencasters now also allow for that. So putting a couple spots in that video where a question pops up that the student answers, it just makes that kind of engaging experience a little bit better. Plus, you can often see the data that your students are putting in, and it's a nice way to have a check for understanding that everyone participates in. And then you couple it with some guided notes. Our experience has been that if you just kind of leave open-ended notes for students to take, it's kind of an old school skill that folks don't really use all that often anymore. And it's a kind of big waste of time. You get students really pausing constantly and writing this like massive list of notes down, and it takes a 6-minute video and makes a 25-minute experience. When you provide really structured guided notes where you indicate what they need to kind of fill in, it makes the video watching experience a very lean one and effective one. So that's hopefully a useful articulation of how it works.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good. I'm curious, as you see people incorporate this model in English classrooms, do they break up the period sometimes with like 20 minutes of self paced learning and then maybe 20 minutes of discussion? Do they sometimes bring the whole class together to talk about a shared text?
frequently, and that
Okay.
isn't unique to English. That's unique to almost every that's common amongst almost every subject area. So
Okay.
when we explain our model to folks, I mean, one thing that we often explain is, first of all, the intention is that educators customize it. I think
Yeah.
too often in education, we kind of think through the lens of accountability. We push educators to be rule followers, and then it's like, do this model in this way every single day, just as it's been explained. And that's just not how it works. So we describe collaboration in a modern classrooms through two lenses. There's organic collaboration, which is in that self-paced experience. I lean on my peers to tackle challenging content. And in that context, you kind of infuse systems, structures, routines that push students to not lean on the educator and always ask the educator their questions, but instead collaborate with each other. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. But then there's a second piece of collaboration, which we call planned collaboration. And planned collaboration is when you actually have a planned discussion. You have a planned Paideia seminar. You have a planned lab. You have a planned opening and closing kind of component of the lesson. And those are moments where the students come together for a purpose. And what we always say is we've never intended to replace discussions. We never intended to replace kind of community-based experiences in classrooms. We are replacing live lectures. So those happen frequently. I know some English units where educators will go one day on self-pacing, one day off self-pacing. They'll do exactly what you just described, which is a self-pace for 30 minutes, and then they'll come together for a discussion. There's a variety of ways you can infuse it to make it right for you and your students.
That makes so much sense to me because I'm thinking about how often you get in groups of writers. And some people are really struggling to write a thesis, and some people are ready for like advanced counter argument strategies and like storytelling strategies. And if you had a self paced writing unit, some kids could probably skip the first 6 lessons. Some kids would really need those lessons. And so you could just have that be like a 20-minute component of each day for a week where people are moving through that. But then you could still be working on projects, having discussions, doing acting in class, like so many other things in tandem with the blended learning model.
Totally. I mean, what we often say too is like when I was teaching through this model, if I started to see a misconception break out in a repeated way,
Mm,
I would just tell the room to like stop what they're doing, put your computers at 45 degrees, like we're having a conversation, right? So it's still your classroom, right? Like
yeah.
your students are still going to stop and do what you think is best. And that's when I go back to that like customization and educators really taking ownership of how the model comes to life in their classroom and kind of releasing from this accountability kind of ideology that pushes folks to think that I'm either doing something right or wrong. There is not a one right way to do this. So we strongly encourage that. And I'll just add, like, I've heard a lot of folks when they initially get exposed to the model will say things like, "How do you do projects with a modern classroom model? How do you do essays and long writing experiences?" And I always kind of pose the question back and say, "How do you do that in a fixed pace model?" Because when you think about large kind of tasks and projects, that's actually where you usually see the biggest variability in student pacing. Because some students, like you said, will kind of move through the early stages of writing an essay much faster than their peers. And there's a lot of advanced kind of techniques you can infuse in. And in a fixed pace setting, you know, that doesn't really allow for that. So it thrives in sort of your project based models in particular.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I like that way of looking at it because I've always, as a teacher, I've always thought of all the models I see as just different elements for my toolbox. Because everyone, yes, you could allow it to like completely take over your thinking about education, or you could say, whoa, I love this about this model. And I'm going to use that, for this unit and for Fridays. And then I love this about, this model. And I find it so helpful to think about pedagogy in that way because there's so many fascinating approaches.
Well, and that's why, we partner with schools and districts and when we're scaling our work, but one of the core tenets of the way that we do our work is that we're an opt-in only model. And part of the reason for that is the exact thing you just said, which is the moment this becomes a mandate,
Right.
then you start to lose track of its purpose, right? And then suddenly teachers don't feel like they have the flexibility to do exactly what you just described. So it's opt-in for a reason. You're opting into the model, but you're also opting into how you use it, and what parts you kind of really double down on and what parts you're a little more flexible with.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you as we're wrapping up here to tell us a little bit about one modern classroom somewhere in the world that's inspiring you right now. It's always so fun to hear the story of how it's taking place in another teacher's classroom.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. There's thousands of them that I've seen in the fall in particular. I think I went to 18 different districts across the country in a 4 week span of time. So I got to see like
Wow.
all these different manifestations of the model.
Mhm.
Um, one place that I think is particularly inspiring is there's a fabulous school down in Jefferson County public schools in Kentucky, and it's an all girls STEAM school. And the principal has done a wonderful job of creating the conditions where the educators really opt in and get excited about this approach. And it's sort of become part of the ethos of the school itself and the learning environment. And as a result, when you go there, the students are sort of almost more bought into the model than anyone else in the building, where you can ask a student like, why are you learning through this modern classrooms format? And they will articulate, well, it empowers me to be in the driver's seat of the learning experience. I have more access to my educator. When I
Mhm.
don't finish my work, that's when I have homework. But if I do use my time effectively, I don't have homework. I get to lean on my peers to tackle content. I really get the opportunity to revise and be reassessed when I don't understand a skill. Like it's part of the way that they're internalizing the learning experience. And I think for us, that is the most important part of changing classrooms. It's almost less to do with, hey, do you actually know how to factor quadratic or write a fabulous thesis statement? And more, do you know how to be in the driver's seat of the learning experience? Because one day you're not actually going to have the four walls of a school building to be there and a teacher in the room to kind of push your learning forward. You're going to kind of be released into post secondary education or the workforce where suddenly those constraints are so much looser. And if you
Mhm.
haven't built the skills to be in the driver's seat, you're going to struggle, and you're going to kind of be blindsided by the realities that are what exist outside of most school buildings. So it's just really cool to see the students own the model in that way. In a variety of classrooms. So it's not just one classroom. That would probably be the example I would use.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great one. Well, Kareem, thanks so much for coming on to tell us a little bit about the Modern Classrooms Project. Where can teachers go to take a next step and learn more about it?
Absolutely. Well, we have our partnerships with schools and districts, but I always tell folks like that's not what I send teachers to. If that's something that a teacher who is at a school or district wants to explore, you can do that on our website at Partner with Us. But the real focus that I say to teachers is our free course has every resource, content template we have.
Wow.
We're a nonprofit, so we don't put a paywall behind any of our resources and ideas. So our free course is at learn.modernclassrooms.org. It's a great place to start to just start learning our model. It's a self-paced, asynchronous kind of digital textbook essentially that allows you to really digest all the components of our model. So that's what I would suggest for teachers. Our website's modernclassrooms.org, but the free course is learn.modernclassrooms.org.
Fantastic. Well, I'll be sure and link it in the show notes so folks can check it out right away.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Check out the show notes for links to learn more about Kareem Farah and the Modern Classrooms Project. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay creative.